To many people today, monarchy seems to be merely a corrosive mixture of snobbery, ceremony and sentiment. But it's far more than that. It's the natural, universal form of government. Not all monarchs are kings, of course. They can just as well be presidents or dictators. But almost everywhere, power comes down to the decisions of one person, which is all that monarchy means. And a modern president or prime minister is a king for the time being, as powerful as any medieval monarch or Roman emperor. But in Britain, or rather in England, this universal fact of monarchy takes on a special meaning, because we still have our real monarchy. It's over 1,500 years old, which means that it's the oldest functioning political institution in Europe. It's also unique because right from the beginning, the monarchy had a strong popular element. This means that its history is more than a tale of kings and queens, of royal heroes like King Alfred and Henry V, and crowned villains like King John. It's also the story of a dialogue between king and people, in which the English learned to rule themselves and became the envy and the example of the world. So this is not another picture book story of kings and queens. Instead, it's a real, grown-up history of how a monarchy created a nation. And it starts where the monarchy and the nation did, the chaos and the violence of the Dark Ages. Years ago, there was only one power that counted in the Western world: Rome. And Rome became the purest, most absolute monarchy the world has ever seen. And Britain, the province of Britannia, was just a tiny part of that monarchy. Rome brought Britain a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and refinement, but the politics that accompanied it were surprisingly crude. All power, in theory and usually in practice, was in the hands of the emperor. He was a god on earth whose task it was to rule and to defend the empire. The duty of his subjects, on the other hand, was to obey and to pay their taxes. The idea that there might be any limit on what the emperor could do, or that others should have a say in what got done, was simply inconceivable. For 400 years, this was the bedrock of life in Britain. It brought peace and prosperity, but already from about 250 AD, Roman power was beginning to crumble. Barbarians poured over the imperial borders. Amongst the most dangerous were seaborne invaders from Germany, which Rome had never conquered. So a great ring of fortresses, like this one at Richborough in Kent, was built along the east coast of Britain to repel the raiders. But in vain. This vast fortress was overwhelmed and abandoned, and its ruins marked the ruin of Britain, or at least the ruin, even the annihilation, of everything that was Roman about Britain. The law, the language, the literature, the religion, all vanished, and all legitimate political authority came to an end, for that had been vested in the emperor. The collapse of Roman rule opened the door to a vast influx of German people. Today, they're known as the Anglo-Saxons, and we know quite a lot about them, because 300 years later, a Northumbrian monk wrote a great book about their early history. The writer's name was Bede, and he's the first great English historian. Bede describes, in what's probably a mixture of fact and legend, how in 449 Hengist and Horsa settled with their followers in Kent, and other groups under other leaders soon settled elsewhere. We rightly think of the Norman conquest as a great turning point in the history of England. But the Saxon conquest was even more important because it created the very idea and reality of England itself. Indeed, it's scarcely possible to exaggerate the scale of the Saxon incursions. Perhaps 200,000 people flooded into a native population of only about 2 million. Proportionately, it's the largest immigration that England has ever known. Moreover, as most of the incomers were men, they quickly turned from immigrants into conquerors. In many areas of the country, DNA evidence shows that up to 90% of the native male population was displaced. They were driven out or killed, and their women, their villages and their farms taken over by the incomers. This is ethnic cleansing at its most savagely effective. But it wasn't only blood that changed. The immigrants brought with them a new language, an early form of English. They gave new names to districts, villages and rivers, names that we still use today. They even renamed the country itself. Britannia became Englaland, and their political values were as different as their language. For this was a community without sharp social distinctions and a people without kings. Today, the closest we can come to the world of those early Anglo-Saxon settlers is the reconstructed village of West Stow in Suffolk. It dates from about 450 AD. What was found here tells us what food they ate, what clothes they wore, and what jewellery they took with them to the grave. Above all, nothing here suggests that anyone was much more important than anyone else. We're a long way here from the exalted autocracy of the Roman Empire, with its huge gap between rich and poor. Instead, the folk of West Stow here seem to have been an essentially egalitarian people, and this egalitarianism was their great legacy to the development of kingship in England. Nevertheless, such communities still needed leaders, especially in times of war. But how did they arise? Our earliest sources on the German peoples, Bede himself and the Roman historian Tacitus, have the answer.
They choose their kings. The power even of the kings is not absolute or arbitrary.
This is the idea of government by consent, in which the leader is chosen by the people, or at least is answerable to them. It was an idea taken by the Anglo-Saxons from their homeland in Germany and transplanted to their new home in England. Here it flourished and became a central part of the English political experience, with powerful echoes in Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution, and the insistence of those Englishmen abroad, the American revolutionaries, that they would pay no taxation without representation. This was the beginning of kingship in England. Local war leaders chosen by the people of the district. War leaders like Beowulf, hero of the Anglo-Saxon epic poem, who, thanks to his prowess, eventually became king, reigned gloriously for 50 winters, and was given a magnificent funeral.
The Geat people built a pyre for Beowulf, stacked it and decked it till it stood foursquare, hung with helmets, heavy war shields. On a height they kindled the hugest of all funeral fires. Flames wrought havoc in the hot bone house, burning it to the core. Heaven swallowed the smoke.
Beowulf's treasures were burned with Beowulf's body. Luckily, other war leaders come kings were not cremated but buried. It is those burials which provide the best evidence for the origins of monarchy in England. The burials are often clustered round even older, prehistoric monuments. By reusing these older sites, it seems, the new men were demonstrating their importance to all their people, Briton and Saxon alike. None of these cemeteries is more impressive than Sutton Hoo in East Anglia, where the mounds crown a ridge by the estuary of the River Devon. In 1939, attracted by some chance finds, archaeologists investigated one of the mounds here. What they found was spectacular. An entire ship had been buried in a barrow. The body had gone, eaten away by the acid soil, but the archaeologists were able to make out the detail of the Dark Age ship, timbers, rivets and all, and the grave goods were astonishing. There's been intense debate about who is buried here, but most scholars are now agreed that these mounds are the burial site of a family called the Woofingers, the royal dynasty of the East Angles. And this, the biggest mound, is probably the burial site of the most important member of the dynasty, a man called Redwald. Bede's history tells us that Redwald ruled in East Anglia as one of several regional leaders in the New England. His power as a warrior and his legendary wealth made him stand out as a first amongst equals. But was he a true king, sanctified by rituals like coronation? He was certainly a very rich man, as his grave goods testify. The gold and garnet jewellery is unequalled in Europe, and the shoulder clasps and belt buckles are unique. From the shores of the Mediterranean Sea came richly engraved silverware from the far-off Byzantine Empire, classical and even Christian. But the barrow also contained objects which are even more intriguing. A pattern-welded sword of the finest steel, of the kind we find named and celebrated in the epic poetry of the time. The ceremonial helmet was far more than a piece of military hardware. For, in later times, the Saxon word for crown was kinnerhelm, or helmet of the kin. And most intriguingly, the burial included a decorated whetstone polished from the hardest rock. Was this perhaps a kind of royal sceptre? These are more than the grave goods of just a rich man. They're regalia, the symbols of a ritualized monarchy, and they include many objects, the sceptre there, if that's what it is, the sword and the helmet, that were later on to figure in real coronation rituals. It's clear that Redwald here is much more than just an elected war leader. He's a real king, like Henry VIII even. Like Henry, he's fond of music, and he's buried with a lyre. Like Henry, he's a discerning patron of the arts, and he's got a court craftsman who's able to make the finest jewellery in Europe. And like Henry, he delights in the weaponry and the accoutrements of the warrior world. But Redwald's grave goods also show something else. He had contacts beyond just the world of the North Sea. He reached out into Christian France and beyond that to the surviving Roman Empire in Byzantium. Because Redwald here is an English king on the cusp of a new world, the world of Christian monarchy. England at the turn of the 6th century, the world of Redwold and his fellow regional kings, was rich, strange and bloody. It was peopled with monsters and dragons, miracle-working swords, and kings who all claimed descent from Woden, chief of the Anglo-Saxon pagan gods. Periodically, by guile or military prowess, one of these petty kings would make himself first amongst equals, or even overlord of most of England. One of the most successful was Ethelbert, King of Kent. Ethelbert's prestige derived from his access to the material and cultural riches across the Channel. For there, unlike here, Roman institutions had not disappeared with the political collapse of the empire. The territory had been conquered by another Germanic people, the Franks, who gave their name to France. But under Frankish rule, Roman society, language and literature, and Roman Christianity had all survived. The result was a glittering prospect for an ambitious Anglo-Saxon king like Ethelbert, and he determined to grab a share of it by marrying a Frankish princess. And in that marriage, two different contrasting worlds, the Anglo-Saxon and the Roman, were to meet. The princess's name was Bertha, and she came to England in about 580 AD. Her arrival began a process which would transform the nature of English kingship, because Bertha was a Christian, brought up in a Christian court. Her husband, Ethelbert, gave her the little Romano-British church of St. Martin's at Canterbury to worship in. It wasn't long before Bertha's Frankish family got a letter telling them that the people of England wished to be converted to the Christian faith. The man who wrote the letter was Gregory, Bishop or Pope of Rome. He was a great man in a great office, for the popes were already claiming to be heirs not only to St. Peter, but of the Roman emperors as well. Gregory's power was different, of course. It consisted not of legions of soldiers, but of regiments of priests and monks. But they were organized with all the old Roman respect for discipline, hierarchy, efficiency, and law. Now, Bertha's marriage to Ethelbert presented Gregory with the opportunity to launch a new Roman conquest of England for Christianity. And his chosen general in the campaign was an Italian monk of good family named Augustine. The party landed in 597 AD. Bede tells us that Augustine approached the king, singing a litany and bearing a silver cross as his standard. Fearing that Augustine might possess magical powers, Ethelbert insisted that the encounter take place in the open air. But the meeting itself was all courteousness on both sides. The pagan King Ethelbert wasn't immediately convinced. Even so, he allowed the mission to stay and start its work in Kent. Ethelbert was playing a subtle political game. He was well aware of the advantages which had accrued to the Franks after their conversion to Christianity. But he needed to be convinced that it would work for him, for the political risks of conversion were enormous. So, in effect, he was inviting Augustine to market test Christianity. Augustine got to work right away with a mission based here in Bertha's little church of St. Martin's, Canterbury. Within a few months, Augustine was claiming success with a mass baptism at Christmas. The mission built itself a new, much grander church as its headquarters, here at St. Augustine's, Canterbury. Soon, even Ethelbert himself was convinced, and he was to be buried here with all the pomp that the Roman Church could muster. The king had been converted, but it was not the fear of hell that convinced Ethelbert. It was politics. For Christianity enhanced his kingship with two things which were very attractive to a Dark Age ruler: Roman ideas about power and Roman ways of doing things. But the Roman Church borrowed much more from the Roman Empire than just ceremony. Like Rome, it used Latin. It had an elaborate system of law and administration, and it built in stone. But above all, it was ruled by a monarch, the Pope, who claimed, like the emperors, absolute and divinely ordained authority. He even used one of the imperial titles, Supreme Pontiff. Now, all this the Church made available to Ethelbert, now that he'd converted to Christianity. Could the old English idea of elective kingship survive these new trappings of imperial and divine authority and the power that went with them? From now on, English kings presented themselves not as pagan warlords, but as the successors of the emperors and the new kings of Israel, literate, godly, and divinely ordained. But despite this new elevated rhetoric of Christian kingship, the life of the typical Anglo-Saxon king remained nasty, brutish, and short. For England was still divided into a clutch of regional monarchies. To the north lay the kingdom of Northumbria. To the south were the kingdoms of Wessex, Sussex, and Kent. And sprawling across the Midlands was Mercia, which was the stage for the next power play in the story of the English monarchy. In the year of our Lord 757, the King of Mercia was murdered at Seckington near Tamworth in Staffordshire. The chronicle tells us that he was treacherously killed by his own household at night in shocking fashion. The king's remains were brought to Repton here and buried in this mausoleum of the Mercian kings. It was another spectacular royal funeral, like those at Sutton Hoo or St Augustine's, Canterbury. And you can still see behind me here one of the alcoves where the richly jewelled reliquaries once stood. But there's a wicked twist to this story, because the man who organised this splendid funeral was perhaps also the man behind the murder. Certainly, he was the one who profited from it. He's one of the forgotten heroes of English history, a man who operated on a European scale and dominated the England of his day. His name is Offa, King of Mercia. The Kingdom of Mercia had formed in the Marches or frontier district of England, where the Saxons fought with the Welsh. From here, Offa's predecessors had pushed their influence south and east right down Watling Street to London and the rich pickings of Kent and Essex. Effectively, they were the lords of the Cross England Highway, the A5. Like other Anglo-Saxon kings, Offa had to exert control through brute military power, but he also aimed to recreate the absolute autocratic authority of the Christian Roman Empire. And here, at Brixworth Church in Northamptonshire, which Offa enlarged and beautified, we have a spectacular insight into Offa's vision. For although the church is Anglo-Saxon, it looks Roman, with its round arches of Roman brick and its lofty wall crowning a prominent hill. Brixworth is an appropriately bombastic monument to the zenith of Mercian power. Offa's Roman-style autocracy brooked no opposition. He was determined to extend his power over the other English kingdoms, and he was ruthless in his methods. Dynasties, which had lasted for centuries, disappeared. Sussex, which had once held sway across the whole of southern England, was swept away. Even the kingdom of Kent, where Ethelbert had established the English tradition of Christian monarchy, was abolished. Nothing impressed a king's image on his subjects more than the coins with which they bought their daily bread. Offa was the first English king to stamp his name on his currency. Here it is, with a portrait of the king, which echoes manuscript images of the biblical King David. And, most astonishing of all, here is his name on a new gold coinage, modelled on coins from the fabulous East, the fount of all wealth, but with Offa's name stamped in the middle of the copied Arabic inscription. But the greatest symbol of the king's imperial power is this, Offa's Dyke, 64 miles long and a continuous earthwork barrier along his frontier with Wales. It is a work of almost studied contempt for the Welsh. This was the largest civil engineering project since the Romans, fully comparable in scale to Hadrian's Wall. And the dyke is more than a monument, it's evidence, proof that Offa could mobilise enough manpower to build it. Offa was bidding for imperial status with a fortification of an imperial kind. Finally, in 787, Offa attempted to ensure the survival of his magnificent vision by having his son anointed king. Offa was creating a dynasty which could inherit his power and status. And, in line with Offa's imperial pretensions, this was the first Christian royal consecration we know of in England, in which the whole panoply of the church was deployed to declare that the boy was God's anointed and his father's unchallengeable successor. But it was also an English ceremony invoking older royal traditions that went back to Sutton Hoo and beyond. For the boy was invested, not with a crown, but with a royal helmet. With this consecration and investiture of his son, Offa was confident the future both of his house and of Mercian power seemed secure. But it was not to be. For Offa seems to have behaved more like the godfather of a mafia family than the ruler of a legitimate state. Indeed, the English were to remember him more for the kings that he murdered than for the kingdom that he built. The result was that within 20 years of his death, in 796, the greater Mercian dominion that he'd created had dissolved back into what was then the usual state of England, a patchwork of smaller, rival kingdoms. Kingdoms that were about to undergo the severest of ordeals, invasion. Four and a half centuries after the Angles and Saxons had begun to raid the English coast, they found themselves in turn invaded by pirates from further north, the Vikings. The Vikings came from Scandinavia, and their effect on England was devastating. Drawn by plunder, for 3 generations their warriors had attacked the courts and monasteries of England, almost destroying the English in the process. But by the 860s, their success had suggested new opportunities to the Viking leaders. Once mere raiders, they now determined on permanent conquest. One by one, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell, until only one remained, Wessex. Now, the Viking leader Guthrum aimed to make Wessex his own. His opponent was, like all successful Anglo-Saxon kings, a man of action and a warrior. But this king of Wessex was more. Indeed, he's just about unique in medieval history. He was an intellectual, a writer, a man whose very words have come down to us. For the first time in our history, we can hear the genuine voice of an English king. His name was Alfred.
The book wenden on English. They is je nemnent on Latin pastoralis, and on English heredebook. Whilum word be wordede, whilum anjit of anjite. And to alcum bishopstoele on minum riche willi anna on
Guthrum the Viking's assault on Alfred's kingdom reached a climax in the winter of 878. Guthrum surprised Alfred and drove him from his hall at Chippenham in Wiltshire. The Saxon king was forced to flee to the marshlands of Somerset, to Athelney. It was the nadir of his fortunes. Later, in one of his writings, Alfred probably recalled his predicament.
On them je sundfulnessum that mood weart ophaven, and on them eafedum.
In the midst of prosperity, the mind is elated, and in prosperity, a man forgets himself. In hardship, he is forced to reflect on himself, even though he be unwilling.
Athelney means royal island, and Alfred fled here because it was an island. It's difficult to find in the middle of the marshes, and the water which floods the fenland in winter makes it difficult to attack. But at the same time, it allows for easy communication by boat with the rest of Wessex. We should imagine Alfred sending out such messengers as he plotted and planned the counterattack as the winter turned into spring. At last, after several months, he was ready, and he sent out the call to arms. Across the shires of Wessex, the message ran, calling the people to their traditional assembly points. One of them was here, in the district of Swanborough, in the Vale of Pewsey. Beneath my feet is the prehistoric burial mound, known locally as Swanborough Tump. It doesn't look much, but it's got its own place in the history of England, because this for centuries was actually the centre of the local community. It was here that the people came once a month for the moot or assembly of what was known as the 100 of Swanborough. And here, in the presence of the king's reeve or bailiff, the people received the king's justice out in the open air. The king's reeve was a royal official responsible for law and order, taxation and the administration of justice. And his 100 court relied, as English government would do for the next 1,000 years, on the distinctively English idea, the jury, a collection of local people, some quite humble, who took part as a matter of course in the local administration of justice and government. Above the level of the 100, Wessex was divided into shires, Hampshire, Wiltshire, Somerset and Dorset. They were run by royal officials, not local magnates, in the same way as the hundreds. So twice a year the people would come to receive the king's justice on the one hand and to make their concerns known to the king's officers on the other. In Wessex, the rough and ready egalitarianism of the earliest settlers had developed into a kind of partnership between the king and people. This partnership, unlike what happened in the rest of Europe, hadn't been hijacked by the leading landowners, and Alfred was well aware of its importance. Because this partnership, the sense of all being in it together, made it easier for Alfred to make heavy demands on his people as the invasion crisis deepened. In contrast to Offa of Mercia, Alfred's kingship combined Christian Roman authority with the traditional participation of the Anglo-Saxon folk.
A man cannot work on any enterprise without resources. In the case of the king, The resources and tools with which he has to rule are that he have his land fully manned.
That he habe his land full manned.
Without these tools, no king may make his ability known.
His craft no make kuda.
Alfred's call to arms went out. It was the test of his style of kingship. And across Wessex in their shire and 100 courts, his people responded. Alfred's army assembled at a prehistoric barrow in Wiltshire, where his grandfather had celebrated the final victory over the British people of Cornwall. But the muster didn't just evoke Wessex's glorious past. Alfred's campaign was also a kind of crusade, for his call to arms coincided with Easter, the feast of the resurrection, and the parallel between Alfred's recovery from defeat and Christ's victory over death wasn't lost on his troops.
When they saw the king, receiving him, not surprisingly, as if one restored to life after suffering such great tribulations, they were filled with immense joy.
From there, the army advanced to a place called Ailey Oak, the traditional site of another Wessex 100 court. There, in the woods, they made camp. In the morning, they would march out to meet Guthrum and his Vikings. Military experts have calculated that this was probably the site of the battle. We can't know for certain, as there have been no systematic excavations, but chance finds have turned up remains of the right period, some of them heavily mutilated. This isn't surprising, because the battle was both savage and bloody. Both sides had too much at stake for it to be anything else. Guthrum knew that for his takeover of the Kingdom of Wessex to succeed, he had to kill Alfred outright. As for Alfred and the men of Wessex, they knew that this was probably their last chance of independence. If Guthrum won, the Viking takeover of England would be complete. On the brow of the hill above Edington, Guthrum stationed the front rank of his shield wall. Alfred's men were forced to attack.
Fighting fiercely with a compact shield wall against the entire Viking army, he persevered resolutely for a long time. He gained the victory through God's will. He destroyed the Vikings with great slaughter.
Alfred had established himself as a great war leader at the head of the shires, and Wessex was saved, for the time being at least. But the future of the rest of England still hung in the balance. At Edington in 878, King Alfred had vanquished an enemy who had threatened the very existence of his kingdom. But winning a battle wasn't the same as winning a war. To do that, Alfred had to put all Wessex on a full-time war footing. He created a navy with bigger and better ships, and he reorganized the army to enable him to put troops into the field at almost any time. Most effective of all was the chain of fortresses he built across his kingdom to deny the Vikings a free passage. Winchester, the capital, was one of the first, and their true significance was much greater than their defensive capability. These burh fortresses weren't private castles, owned by some lord or bishop and manned by his retainers. Instead, they were fortified communities founded by the king and defended by his people. And, as Alfred had intended from the beginning, they quickly became real towns, boosting trade, and with it, taxes. As a result, the king got rich and his people grew prosperous, whilst the word borough, as we pronounce it today, started to assume its modern meaning as well, of a self-governing urban community under royal patronage. And the first and greatest of those royal patrons was Alfred himself. The burghs were so important to Alfred that their names often replace the names of the moneyers on the reverse of his coins. This one displays the monogram of the mint at London. For London was the burgh of burghs. As the Viking tide ebbed in England, Alfred pushed forward beyond his kingdom's traditional frontiers. But it was his capture and refortification of the city of London that marked a new direction in his kingship. London was already the largest town and the commercial powerhouse of England, and it had been the jewel in King Offa's crown. Now the jewel was Alfred's and the prestige that went with it. So, following his capture of the city and its refortification in 886, Alfred inflated his title and his ambition. Hitherto, he'd only been king of the West Saxons. Now he called himself king of the Angles and the Saxons. Could a claim for Alfred to be king of all the English be far behind? For that's how he's described in this vital document.
This is that Frith, that Alfred king, and Guthrum king, and
It's the peace treaty Alfred made with Guthrum, which formalised Viking control of eastern England. But in the treaty, Alfred describes himself as king of all the English, not ruled over by the Danes. Alfred, in fact, ruled only part of England, but already there's the beginning here of a national political idea. And Alfred's books tell the same story. It was Alfred who commissioned the National Book of Record, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It's called Anglo-Saxon not only because of its subject matter, but because of its language. For unlike the chronicles produced elsewhere in Europe, it's written not in Latin, but in the vernacular, Anglo-Saxon. This means that it's not written by churchmen for churchmen. Instead, it's a king talking to his people in the language that they understand, and his people talking to themselves. And there's no doubt that this use of Anglo-Saxon, the vernacular, the language of the people, is a deliberate policy of consciousness raising on Alfred's part. Because not only does Alfred himself make many such translations into Anglo-Saxon, he also, in the letter which introduces the pastoral care, tells us why.
We there on that, ye Theoda Wendon.
We too should turn into the language that we can all understand, certain books which are the most necessary for all men to know, so that all the freeborn young men now in England who have the means to apply themselves to it may be set to learning until the time that they can read English writings properly.
When Alfred died in 899, he still ruled over only part of England, but his legacy was to be the permanent unification of the country. The actual work was the task of his sons and grandsons, but it was Alfred who, in the crucible of the Viking invasions, had forged an idea of England that was more than simply cultural or linguistic. It was political, or rather, uniquely in Europe at the time. It was a combination of all three. In the years after his death, his successors pushed back the Vikings, taking over all the land they had settled. And as they did so, they created shires on the Wessex pattern across the whole of England up to the Humber. And this political geography is with us today. The creation of England was almost complete. But the House of Wessex did not stop there. In 2 generations, English kings had established their lordship over the whole of the rest of Britain, over Wales, Scotland and the Western Isles. It was time for them to celebrate.
Here was Edgar, Lord of the English, hallowed to King. At Aikmanchester, the ancient city, whose modern sons the island dwellers have called Bath.
About 70 years after Alfred's death, his great-grandson Edgar came here to Bath for what was probably his second coronation. He'd already been crowned as King of the English, but meantime he'd established his authority over all Britain. Hence the choice of Bath for another, bigger ceremony. For in Bath there was a unique combination of a Christian abbey next door to the largest, the most impressive ruins of Roman Britain. It was an incomparable setting for Edgar's coronation as King of the First British Empire, 10th century style.
Let thy most sacred unction flow upon his head, and descend into his heart, and enter his soul. And let him by the grace be worthy of the promises which the victorious kings have obtained, that in this present life he may reign with happiness, and finally attain to their fellowship in the kingdom of heaven. Receive this ring, the seal of the holy faith, the strength of thy kingdom, and the increase of thy power, whereby thou mayest learn to drive back thy foes with triumph, destroy heresies, unite those whom thou hast conquered, and bind them firmly to the Catholic faith.
Unlike Saxon kings of an earlier age, Edgar was invested with a crown, not a helmet, and the service, conducted by his archbishop, deliberately compared the king to Christ. This coronation was so spectacular that when in 1910, more than 1,000 years later, the King Emperor George V was eager to emphasize his imperial status, he turned to Edgar's coronation service as one of his models. And he was right to do so, for his kingship was the lineal descendant of Edgar's and of Alfred's, and of that participatory monarchy which had been first pioneered in England over a millennium before. Out of the chaos of post-Roman Dark Age Britain, the English had created the world's first nation-state. One king, one country, one church, one currency, one language, and a single unified representative national administration. Never again in England would sovereignty descend to the merely regional level. Never again, despite disagreements and troubles, wars and even revolutions, would the idea of England and the unity of England ever be challenged. In December 1154, one of the most charismatic of all kings of England began his reign. Henry II was a star amongst monarchs whose huge personality and keen intelligence would extend royal power as much by law as by the sword. But, Like many stars, Henry was cursed with a turbulent family whose prides and passions would do much to undermine his extraordinary achievements. This is the story of King Henry II and his heirs. Henry II was just 21 years old when he inherited the throne of England. But Henry was only half English. He spoke French and he was heir to great lands and titles in France. The young Henry was a product of that hybrid Anglo-French culture which had ruled in England since the time of the Norman conquest. He was born here in Anjou, his father's ancestral lands in the heart of France. But if his father were French, his mother was the daughter of the English king, Henry I, and she made sure that the young Henry was familiar with England as well. Between the ages of 10 and 14, he lived at Bristol, where he had an English guardian and an English tutor who gave him his lifelong love of learning. He then returned to France, where he accumulated territories year by year: Normandy, Anjou, and finally Aquitaine, through his marriage to the beautiful Eleanor. But England was the greatest prize of all, fought over for 20 years by Henry's mother Matilda and his cousin Stephen. It now fell into Henry's grasp. Partly because Stephen had no heir, but above all because the Anglo-Norman aristocracy, the barons, saw in Henry a man they had to do business with. But though he was the barons' candidate, Henry quickly showed them who was master. It was a time when God and his angels slept, as the chroniclers lamented, with pardonable exaggeration. Nowadays, such thuggish disorder tends to come from those at the bottom of the social pile. Then it came from the men at the top, known as barons. The barons seized royal castles and they built new illegal castles of their own. And the hard-won unity of England threatened to disintegrate into a series of baronial statelets, each with its own castle capital. Henry, who had a vigorous sense of royal authority, was determined to stamp on this development. So royal castles, he decreed, must be returned to the king, and illegal castles should be demolished. One man, Hugh Mortimer, the Marcher Lord, dared to resist. Henry took his forces to the Welsh Marches, the seat of Mortimer's power, and he laid siege simultaneously to all three of Mortimer's castles, including this one at Wigmore in Herefordshire. One by one, Mortimer's castles surrendered, until finally, on the 7th of July, 1155, Baron Mortimer himself made a formal submission to the king in front of a specially summoned assembly of bishops, earls and barons. Henry had given an object lesson in the arts of kingship to his mightiest subjects, and he'd made a spectacularly successful start to his reign. Henry's vision of royal authority extended beyond England to the whole of Britain, over which, like his greatest predecessors, the Anglo-Saxon Edgar and the Norman William the Conqueror, he saw himself as having imperial authority. The King of Scots was driven back behind the old frontiers of his kingdom. In Wales, he made the princes do homage to him, formally acknowledging him as their superior. For 2 decades, England had been weak, but now the crown was worn by a man whose personality matched the pretensions of the position. He overawed and faced down opponents at every turn.
He is a great, indeed the greatest of monarchs, for he has no superior of whom he stands in awe, nor subject who may resist him.
His energy and temper were legendary, and his physical presence mesmerizing.
His face was one upon which a man might gaze 1,000 times, and still feel drawn to gaze on again.
Henry's charismatic personality gave him the best of both worlds. He could consult and take advice as an English king was bound to, but he could always be pretty confident of winning the argument. And he could win even when he wasn't there in person, thanks to his innovations in the law, which became a kind of mirror reflecting and multiplying his royal authority. The main writing office was known as the Chancery, and these are typical of the documents that it produced. They're called writs, that is, standardized royal orders. The writ itself is written out on the slip of parchment, and then it's authenticated by attaching the Great Seal. The seal is deliberately large and impressive, and it carried the king's image to the furthest corners of his dominions. And it makes an important point about the nature of kingship. On the front, the king is seated as a lawgiver and judge. On the reverse, he is mounted and armed as the warrior defender of his people. The writ is much less showy than the seal, but its effects were even more far-reaching. For, in the course of Henry's reign, writs were developed to deal with all the most common legal problems of the king's subjects. They were mass-produced by the Chancery clerks, and they were available for a fee to every freeman. Previously, the king's justice had depended on the king's actual presence. Now, with the writ, the seal, and the magic of writing, the king and his justice could be everywhere for everybody. But Henry's was not the only monarchy in England. There was another power in the land. The church was a state within a state. It was also a superstate whose boundaries were even wider than those of Henry's empire. Once the church had been the nursemaid of monarchy, now it threatened to become its master. In the Middle Ages, the power of the church soared over England and all Western Europe. Like the European Union today, whose frontiers it shares, the power of the church reached everywhere, crossing borders, claiming rights, and dispensing its own justice in its own courts. But, unlike the European Union, the church also had its own officials on the ground, the priests, bishops, and archbishops, and above all, it had its own very visible head, the Pope in Rome. The Pope, as the successor of St. Peter, claimed the religious allegiance of all Catholic Christians, including kings and emperors. But the Pope was also an elective monarch, the heir of the Roman emperors, who often claimed to be the political superior of kings as well. And kings, however good Christians they were, rarely took that claim lying down. No one was less disposed to lie down than Henry. He thought he'd found the perfect instrument to control the church in Thomas Becket, whom he appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket was a middle-class Londoner whom Henry had plucked from obscurity to make Chancellor, Chief Minister, and his closest personal friend. He expected similar loyalty from his new Archbishop. In vain. From the first, Becket went out of his way to pick a fight with the king. He ostentatiously resigned the chancellorship, and he took an extreme and intransigent stance on any issue, however petty, which affected the church's claim to absolute independence. Why the transformation in Becket from the king's dearest friend to his bitterest enemy? Had he undergone a religious transformation? Was he just a consummate actor, throwing himself with zest into a new part? Was he trying to prove himself to his fellow clergy, many of whom thought him no better than a royal stooge? Any and every of these explanations is possible. What is certain, however, is that Becket's behaviour provoked an equal and opposite reaction in the king. Neither man would give way. One or the other would have to break or to be broken. Henry's first 10 years on the throne had been a glittering success. But now he confronted two major challenges. Who should succeed to Henry's vast empire after his death? And where did ultimate authority lie? With the king or with the church and churchmen? It was the issue of priests who committed crimes like murder and highway robbery, which sparked off the final clash with the church. These thugs in cassocks were tried in church courts where they received derisory sentences. After the collapse of one such murder trial, Henry demanded that the man be handed over to a royal court. Becket refused. Henry met the challenge head-on, and at a meeting of the council held in the royal palace of Clarendon near Oxford, he tabled a list of what he claimed were the customs of the realm. The customs left the church jurisdiction over matters of faith, but disputes about property or the punishment of clergy who were convicted of crimes like robbery or homicide were to belong in the future to the king's laws. Becket disdained Henry's pseudo-historical arguments. Instead, as usual, he took the high moral ground, basing himself on the words in the Bible, "Touch not mine anointed." But even Becket yielded before Henry's crude threats of force and accepted the constitutions. Soon, however, Becket repudiated his submission on the grounds that it had been extorted under duress, and the dispute between king and archbishop flared up more fiercely than before. And this time, in fear of his life, Becket fled abroad. But Becket's flight only focused attention on the issue of the succession. Henry decided to leave each of his 4 sons a substantial inheritance. In 1169, he announced how his dominions would be divided on his death. His eldest son and principal heir, Henry, would receive England, Normandy and Anjou. Richard would be Duke of Aquitaine, and Geoffrey would receive Brittany. There was no land as yet for his beloved baby son, John. Henry had an eye on conquering Ireland for him. Henry had 2 reasons for dividing his lands amongst his sons. The first was to placate the King of France, whose kingdom was threatened with extinction by the vastness of Henry's power, whilst the second was to try to keep the peace amongst his teenage sons, who, it was already clear, had inherited his own ferocious temper. But in practice, the division of his lands proved to be a disastrous miscalculation. He had whetted his sons' appetite with the promise of future power, but he'd given them little or nothing in the present, and there was also a risk that the irritated princes and the exiled archbishop might make common cause. For, from his haven in France, Becket continued to defy Henry by making ever more grandiose claims to the independence of the church.
Since it is certain that kings receive their power from the church, so you have not the power. Restore to the Church of Canterbury, from which you received your promotion and coronation, the rank and status it held in the time of your predecessors and mine. You have not the power to absolve or excommunicate anyone, nor to drag clerks before secular tribunals.
Henry brushed aside Becket's claims, but Becket on the loose and abroad was more dangerous, Henry felt, than Becket at home. So a compromise was patched up, and Becket was allowed to return to England. And what a return! For at Christmas 1170, word reached Henry that Becket, who'd learned nothing and forgotten nothing, was up to all his old tricks. The archbishop, his enemies insinuated to the king, was careering round the country with armed knights, and he was excommunicating bishops who were loyal to Henry. Something snapped, and there resulted one of those famous Plantagenet rages. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" the king exclaimed, or words to that effect. Now, Henry had said such things before, and nothing much had happened. But this time, 4 royal knights took the king at his word, and they rode furiously to England and to Canterbury to bring Becket to account, whatever that might mean. On the 29th of December, the 4 knights, Reginald Fitzurse, William de Tracy, Hugh of Morville and Richard Brito, arrived at Canterbury Cathedral. They accused Becket of treachery against his king. Becket hotly denied the charges. The knights withdrew, menacingly, saying they'd be back. The other clergy begged Becket to flee whilst there was still time, but he refused, deciding instead to make a final stand. The knights came back with drawn swords. It was Reginald Fitzurse who struck the first blow, taking off the back of Becket's head. Still denouncing his assailants, the archbishop fell to the pavement of his cathedral, and the others piled in. Moments later, Becket lay dead. When he heard the news, Henry plunged into an agony of grief, shutting himself away for 3 whole days, so that his friends feared for his health, if not for his life. Was it personal grief for the death of his one-time friend, or horror at what had been done in his name? In either case, the king's response fully matched the enormity of the deed, for Europe was stunned by the murder of an archbishop in his own cathedral on the orders of his own king. And letters rained upon the Pope, even from members of Henry's own family, demanding that he take action against the sacrilegious king who was worse than a Nero or even than a Judas. And Becket's ghost, growing more powerful year by year, was to serve as the perfect cover for resistance or rebellion against the murderer king. The result was that, as Henry feared, the problems of the church and the succession came together and threatened to overwhelm him. In 1173, a great rebellion started. It was led by Henry's own elder sons. Henry decided that it was Becket's memory that was the greater threat. He would exorcise it with a single grand gesture of self-abasement. First, Henry fasted. Then, stripped only to a rough woolen shirt, he walked barefoot to Becket's shrine, here in Canterbury Cathedral, where he prostrated himself before his erstwhile enemy. Next, he, Henry, King of England, submitted to a public scourging by all of the clergy present. Bishops, abbots, and each of the monks of Canterbury took it in turn to flog him. Finally, he lay all night and all day on the cold stones in front of the shrine. It was an extraordinary, untypical gesture by that proud and passionate man. But the penance and the humiliation, he calculated, was worth it if it contrived to separate Becket, the saint as he now was, from the coalition of Henry's enemies now arrayed against him. And it did, almost immediately. The king awoke the following morning to hear that an invasion of England, planned by the rebels, had been thwarted. Henry had indeed stooped to conquer, for, despite the sound and fury over Becket's martyrdom, Henry was able to preserve many of his claims over the church, and subsequent kings of England would reassert and intensify them until finally they assumed that supremacy over the church of which Henry had only dreamed. His furious energy saw off repeated acts of disloyalty and rebellion by his sons, in alliance with Henry's most dangerous enemy, the King of France. But finally, in 1189, Henry lost his grip. He was defeated in battle by Richard and the King of France, and his health collapsed. Mortally sick, and already a broken man at the age of only 56, Henry was carried back in a litter, here to his castle of Chinon in his native Anjou, to die. One of the conditions imposed on him by Richard and the King of France was that he should pardon the conspirators against him. When the list was read out, it included the name of his beloved youngest son, John. It was the final blow. "Why should I reverence Christ?" the dying king cried out when he was asked to make his final confession. "And why should I honour him who has taken all my honour from me?" Confess, nevertheless, he did, and immediately afterwards, on the 6th of July, 1189, Henry died. Henry's body was brought for burial to the nearby abbey of Fontevraud, the traditional burial place of the Counts of Anjou. Like a wounded animal, he'd gone home to die. Yet he had been one of England's most successful kings, able in his prime to enforce his authority on barons, bishops, and even other princes. He had turned his vision of kingship into a reality. Would his successors be able to sustain it? Alongside the tomb of Henry II, here in the Abbey of Fontevraud in Anjou, lies this one, of his son and eventual heir, Richard. Richard ruled the family empire for almost 10 years until he was mortally wounded in a siege here in France. But during all that time, Richard spent only 6 months in England. Instead, he used England merely to bankroll his adventures elsewhere, above all on crusade in the Holy Land. These adventures won Richard a golden reputation and the name Coeur de Lion, Lionheart. He would be a hard act to follow, especially as England had got used to an absentee king, and especially as his heir was his younger brother, John. "My brother John," Richard sneered, "is not man enough to conquer a country if there is anyone to offer even the feeblest resistance." So John was no mighty warrior like his father Henry II, nor a charismatic leader of men like his brother Richard Coeur de Lion. Still worse, there was an unfortunate streak of mistrustfulness, even paranoia, in his character. On the other hand, he was unusually interested in the mechanics of government, which he pursued with an often obsessive interest. There is no more contrary breed than professional historians. For John's contemporaries, and for most succeeding generations of historians, John was the very model of a bad king. But now a new generation of historians has come along who argue, on the contrary, that John was a good thing, or at any rate, a good administrator. And indeed it's true that his reign sees the start of the great parchment rolls which record the government's correspondence and which form the essential basis for scholarly history. But to praise John for being a royal filing clerk is historians looking after their own with a vengeance. For John's obsession with record-keeping was a sign not of strength, but of weakness. He was so keen on documentation because he was so mistrustful of his subjects, and his subjects in turn distrusted a king who was nitpicking and always eager to revive an old, outdated royal imposition and to invent a new one. The result was tax, tax, and more tax, and what made things worse was the fact that John had the misfortune to confront the most effective king of France for generations, Philip Augustus. By 1204, John had been shorn of a third of his territories, including his ancestral lands of Normandy, Anjou, and Brittany. For the first time since the Norman conquest, the King of England was that and little more. In an attempt to recover his position, John decided to follow in his father's footsteps by striking at the power of the church. But once again, he had the misfortune to encounter one of the greatest medieval popes, Innocent III. The struggle began as a dispute about the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but it quickly escalated as both sides wheeled in their heaviest weapons. Innocent laid England under an interdict. This was a kind of clerical general strike in which the clergy refused to say Mass, marry couples, or bury corpses. In retaliation, John resorted to one of Margaret Thatcher's favourite weapons against the Unions and confiscated all the property of the church, which amounted to almost a third of the land in England. Who would win? The clerical strikers or the royal strike breaker? Pope Innocent, despite his name, was a formidable politician who turned real weapons as well as spiritual ones against the King of England. For he not only excommunicated John, but declared him deposed and invited Philip Augustus, John's other great enemy, to launch a crusade and seize the throne of England for himself. Under threat by his two most dangerous enemies, John had to buy one off, and the price he was prepared to pay was astonishing. It was England itself. On the 15th of May 1213, King John received the Pope's representative at Dover Castle. At the meeting, John agreed to everything that the Pope demanded: to do penance for his offences against the Church, to accept the Pope's choice as Archbishop of Canterbury, and to pay compensation for everything that he'd seized from the Church. But John also went much further, and in a dramatic move, he issued a charter in which, of his own free will, he acknowledged the Pope as his overlord and agreed to pay a large annual cash tribute. John had handed ultimate authority over the Kingdom of England to the Pope and had agreed to pay him a yearly fee to lease it back. John had saved his neck, but at what cost? He was humiliated at home and abroad as a king and as a man. There was now only one way for John to re-establish his authority, to reconquer his lost lands in France. He raised a great army, but he needed a great deal of cash to pay for it. The barons were pressed hard, and the rest of his subjects wrung dry. John was playing a desperate game for the highest of stakes. If the dice rolled in his favour and he won a great victory in France, all would be well. But once again, his luck failed. On the 27th of July 1214, the English and French armies met at Bouvines in Flanders. At first the English seemed victorious, and Philip himself was thrown from his horse, but the French struck back and overwhelmed the English. Paris rejoiced, but in England John faced mutiny. The barons sank their own differences and presented a united front against the king. Never again, they decided, would a king be able to behave as John had done, and they backed up their demands with the threat of overwhelming force. The part of honest broker between the king and the barons was played by Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He professed to be neutral, but in fact he inclined to the barons and secretly helped them structure their demands. Finally, the terms were agreed, and on the 15th of June, 1215, the two sides met in a field near Windsor known as Runnymede. The barons, who had come fully armed, presented their demands, and King John, reluctantly and already in bad faith, granted what they wished. The agreement became known as Magna Carta, the Great Charter. But in fact, it was only the most famous and ambitious of a succession of attempts, stretching back through the coronation oath of Henry I and the memories of Anglo-Saxon England, to define the rights and duties of king and people. The original of Magna Carta sealed by King John himself, has long since vanished. After all, the king had no desire to preserve the record of his own humiliation. But this, kept in Salisbury, is one of the only 4 survivors of the copies that were distributed to each county in 1215. Nowadays, the fame of Magna Carta rests on clauses like this: no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his goods or possessions, save by lawful judgment of his peers or equals, or by the law of the land. Or this one: to no one shall we sell or deny or delay justice. Provisions like these are, or have become, what we call basic human rights, and echoes of them survive in the Statute Book and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But they come a very long way down the document. At the top are the provisions that really concern the authors of the document, the bishops and the barons. The first clause states that the Church in England shall be free, that is, free from royal interference, whilst the second limits the king's rights to exact death duties or fines from barons when their lands were handed over to their heirs. Magna Carta quickly became, and remained, a touchstone of liberties in the Middle Ages itself, and it also had very sharp contemporary teeth, because this clause allows the barons to use force to bring John into line if he showed any sign of backsliding from Magna Carta. It was tough stuff, and John didn't like it one bit. It seemed a total defeat, but John had one last card up his sleeve. Immediately he appealed to his new overlord, the Pope, to have it annulled. Innocent agreed, and Magna Carta was promptly declared null and void. The barons were outraged at the king's faithlessness, and open war broke out. For the barons, it was no longer a question of restraining John, but of dethroning him. They even turned to the national enemy and invited Louis, son of the French king, to take the English throne. Louis invaded, and by the autumn of 1216 had seized much of the southeast of England, including London itself. Would England be divided? Or would there be the first violent change of dynasty since 1066? Suddenly, at this point, on the night of the 18th of October, 1216, John died. His heir was his son Henry, but Henry was only 9 years old. The child's cause looked hopeless, but with John safely out of the way, the prospect of a French succession lost its attraction for an important group of barons and bishops. Instead, they decided that the young Henry should be brought to Gloucester and crowned as quickly as possible. On the morning of the 28th of October, 1216, the impromptu coronation took place. The boy, who was a grave, handsome, golden-haired child, was brought to Gloucester Cathedral here. He wore a specially made set of little royal robes. First, he took the customary coronation oath. Then, he paid homage to the Pope's representative, the legate. Finally, and with all the traditional ceremonies, he was anointed and crowned, though the crown, in fact, was one of his mother's tiaras or hair ornaments. Bearing in mind the circumstances, it was inevitable that Henry's coronation was a bit of a makeshift affair, but it was real nonetheless. It had imbued him with the magical, mystical authority of kingship, and he never forgot the fact. Now it was up to his regents to persuade his country to accept him as king. Their first moves were not military, but propagandistic, for already there was something called public opinion, and they appealed to it by issuing a letter in the king's name, which argued that his youth meant that he'd had no part in the sins of his father.
We hear that a quarrel arose between our father and certain nobles of our kingdom. Whether the justification or not, we do not know.
Next, Henry's regents made a major political concession. They reissued Magna Carta without the clauses authorising the use of force against the king. At a stroke, the charter was rescued from oblivion and the cause of civil war removed, and Henry universally recognised as king. For the remainder of his minority, the spirit of Magna Carta was adhered to, and the great men of the kingdom had a real say in government. Magna Carta had saved Henry's crown. It remained to be seen if he would honour the charter when he came of age. In 1232, Henry III was preparing a coup d'etat that would overthrow the men and measures that had restrained him for so long. Though he was 25, it had been difficult to persuade his nobles that he was no longer a child, and that they should relinquish control. Now he was determined to be king in deed as well as king in name, and he was determined, above all, to break free from the shackles of Magna Carta. Henry was also influenced by the revived monarchy of France. He favoured French courtiers, and his greatest building project was wholly French in style. This, the Westminster Abbey that we know today, is essentially the work of Henry, though its interior is only a pale shadow of the masterpiece that he created, which glowed with red and blue and gold. Work started in 1245. It cost a fortune, employed hundreds of craftsmen, and lasted for 25 years in the most ambitious project of church building that Western Europe had yet seen. Indeed, it was so ambitious that it almost bankrupted the king and inflicted severe political damage on him. But for Henry, it was worth it, for he was building a monument to the greater glory of God and to the monarchy. Westminster Abbey was intended to be the crowning glory of Henry's vision of kingship. But it was a vision that was intensely controversial to some of his barons. For it seemed as un-English as the architecture of the abbey itself. For Henry's models of kingship were foreign, the French monarchy and the papacy, and his agents were foreign too. Henry showered power and wealth onto a close-knit circle of French relatives and favourites. Inevitably, the English barons resented it, and they were spurred on by Henry's autocratic style of kingship. They were furious with the king for his successful reassertion of royal power and his appointment of his foreign relations to high office, and they saw the two as being closely connected, claiming that Henry's foreign officials treacherously whispered to him that the king was above the law. The barons were determined to restore the traditional English practice. They would reimpose Magna Carta, and they would devise a new machinery of government that would so tie the king's hands that neither he nor his heirs would ever be able to escape from it again. The nobles quickly found a leader in Simon de Montfort. De Montfort was himself a Frenchman. Like so many of his compatriots, he'd been brought to England by Henry, showered with favour and given the earldom of Leicester. He'd even dared to marry the king's sister without Henry's permission. This marriage sowed the seeds of distrust between Simon and the king. Once, when the two men were out hunting together and had stopped to shelter from a thunderstorm, Henry is said to have told Simon that, much as he feared the lightning, he feared Simon more. The key to Simon's character was his past as a crusader. Crusaders see the world in simple black and white. Once Simon's enemy had been the infidel, but now it was those who supported Henry's autocratic style of monarchy. In 1258, de Montfort and 6 other leading barons swore an oath of mutual loyalty. Together, they were more than a match for the king, and they had their own distinct ideas of how England should be run. The two sides met at Oxford. The council at Oxford drew up a revolutionary new way of governing the country that was intended to turn England into a crowned republic. And Henry, despite his high view of kingship, had no choice but to agree. The provisions of Oxford, as the new constitutional blueprint was known, looked back to Anglo-Saxon England with its tradition of a strong national community. And they also looked abroad to Germany and Italy, where new self-governing communes or city-states like Florence or Venice were appearing. The result was to leave Henry as king, but king in name only. Instead, his powers would be exercised by an elected council of 15, which in turn would answer to parliaments meeting at 3 set intervals a year. No other European country had tried such an audacious governmental experiment, and no other king had been subject to such humiliation. The king was determined to avenge himself. The only way was force, and in 1264 the two sides confronted each other outside Lewes in East Sussex. Inspired by de Montfort's leadership and wearing the Crusader cross, his army quickly reduced the king's forces to a broken rabble. After the battle, Henry took refuge here at Lewes Priory. And here too he was joined by his son Edward, who'd been victorious in his sector of the battle, but had been unable to save the day for his father. Would the royalists give in, or would they try to resume the fight? To concentrate minds, Simon's troops shot off a volley of burning arrows, which set fire to the roof of the priory church. Intimidated and surrounded, Henry decided to surrender. But Simon's terms were tough. Henry had to swear once again to submit to the baronial government of the provisions of Oxford. And to make sure that he kept his word this time, he was compelled to hand over his son Edward as a hostage for his good behaviour. The King of England was now a puppet with only the trappings of kingship, as Simon, in the name of defending freedom, ruled both king and kingdom. Not even John had sunk so low. Simon was now free to impose his own vision of monarchy on Henry. The king was reduced to a mere figurehead, whilst all power was exercised by Simon's baronial clique, who claimed to be acting in the name of the whole community of England. But de Montfort's ideas also appealed far beyond the baronial class, and this led him to broaden dramatically the membership of what was already becoming known as Parliament. Hitherto, Parliament had consisted of nobles and bishops, but in 1265, Simon enfranchised new groups. Simon summoned representatives, small groups of knights from each county and burgesses or local bigwigs from the more important towns. Such representatives had been summoned before to consult on taxation, but this was the first time that they'd been invited to discuss and to decide the great affairs of the realm. It was a blatant bid for support for Simon's revolution from the groups immediately below the magnates, the wider community of the realm. It was also a milestone in the history of Parliament. But despite such bold moves, Simon's revolution was to be short-lived. There was still a strong royalist party, and for all Simon's own high ideals, his followers proved to be as selfish and as grasping as the king's fallen favourites. Just as the tide was turning, the king's son and heir, the Lord Edward, escaped from captivity and raised an army. Edward met fellow royalists here at Ludlow Castle. He made the symbolic promise to uphold Magna Carta and then marched to meet de Montfort's forces. The armies met just north of the town of Evesham. Simon was hoping every minute to be joined by his son at the head of reinforcements, but the reinforcements never arrived, and without them, de Montfort was overwhelmed. De Montfort himself was killed, only 15 months since his great victory at Lewes. This monument to Simon de Montfort was erected in the grounds of the former Evesham Abbey in the 1960s, and it's a sign that, 700 years after his defeat and death in the battle fought near here, he's not forgotten. Contemporaries remembered him too. Already at the time of his death, he was a folk hero. Soon there were reports of miracles at his tomb, and he was even compared to that other great scourge of kings, St. Thomas Becket. But the royalists hated him, and in a grisly revenge, they dismembered his body as the corpse of a condemned traitor. It would be less easy, however, to uproot the political ideas that de Montfort had planted. But for the moment, the royalists had triumphed, and the authority of the monarchy was restored, though in practice it would be exercised by the Lord Edward. But there was one final moment of glory left to the old king. In 1269, the new Westminster Abbey, which had cost so much money and political goodwill, was finally consecrated. The king himself and his sons bore the saints' relics to their magnificent new shrine, which was encrusted with gold mosaic and inlaid with precious marbles. The shrine was the work of Italian craftsmen, and it spoke of Roman imperial power and grandeur. And, despite all the crises of his reign, Henry's view of his own position remained equally exalted, and he still saw himself as combining the powers of Pope and Emperor in his own kingdom. Many of his nobility, of course, led by Simon de Montfort, had taken the opposite point of view, and they'd come within a whisker of victory. Which way would the balance swing in the future